A timeline dictates the order of which events in a video game happen. The problem with Zelda is that there's no official release telling you what game came after the other, so there is no official timeline for the Zelda universe. And that's why it has been one of the hottest debate topics for fans when talking about the Zelda universe. So I'm gonna go ahead and take the helm on this one and break down Zelda. So this is gonna be my timeline for Zelda. Now, before I get started, there are a bunch of disclaimers that I'm going to put forth for this video. The first one is that there are a lot of bits and pieces of official information from official sources declaring what game came after the other, as well as the fact that there are some obvious sequels and obvious prequels. And I will be mentioning those as I go, but have in mind that much of the timeline is actually pure speculation, as really the creators of Zelda could smoke a doobie one night and decide to change everything. And they could, because it's not official. So because of this, and because of the incredible amount of misinformation and mistranslation that happened in the 80s and the 90s, I'm going to take the story of each game as the primary canonical background for this video. The second disclaimer is that I'll try to avoid spoiling any story details for you guys, but every single story detail that has anything to do with the game's position in the timeline, it's going to get spoiled. So there will be things that are going to be spoiled, and there's nothing I can do about that, and I'll try to keep them down as much as I can, but I wanted to let you guys know beforehand. The third and last disclaimer is that there are many different theories regarding the timeline of Zelda, and that is because there are different ways in which you can actually look at the games. For example, you can argue that the Four Swords saga is actually a different game altogether, and that it has no real place in the full timeline of Zelda. Now, I beg to differ, but that's the reason why there are different theories, and there's different ways that you can look at the games. But with all the disclaimers out of the way, let's get started. Skyward Sword has been officially named the first game in the timeline. The reason for this is that it elaborates on the origins of the Master Sword and the origins of Ganon. Another important piece of information that helps it be categorized as the first game in the timeline is that it elaborates on why Zelda is actually important in the series. In Skyward Sword, it turns out that Zelda is actually the reincarnation of Hylia, a goddess. Now, this goddess is tasked with the protection of Hyrule. So you can argue that that is the reason why Zelda is important in many of the games where she actually plays a role in it, as she will be forever tasked with protecting Hyrule even after her constant incarnations, which goes hand in hand with Skyward Sword's last boss, Demise, as he will put a curse on Link and Zelda for all eternity. The curse says that Demise's anger will forever continue to come to haunt Zelda and Link, and we see this representing Ganondorf throughout the series. Now, before I get any further though, we have to talk about the Four Swords trilogy. This trilogy is one of the hardest to put in a timeline, as it relates to a different sword rather than the Master Sword. Now, I will not spoil it for you in regards to Four Swords and Four Swords Adventures, as there is a timeline for those. The problem is the Minish Cap. Now, I am putting the Minish Cap first in the entire series. The reason for this is that in this game there is no triforce and there is no Master Sword, and because there is no talk about them, one is led to believe that they don't exist yet in the series. Another great point for this game is that it explains where Link actually gets its green tunic, as well as the reason why it wears the hat like it does. And because you use this tunic in Skyward Sword, one is led to believe that this happened before that. So that's why I'm putting the Minish Cap first in the timeline for this game. This is also the reason why the Kokiri actually wore the same garments as Link does. You see, the Kokiri are actually spirits, and they can change the shape of themselves to whatever they want. So it is said that the Kokiri actually changed to the shape of the hero of Legends. So at least definitely the Minish Cap has to come before Ocarina of Time, but I will still put it before Skyward Sword as the first game in the timeline. Now, before Skyward Sword came out, Ocarina of Time was the designated first game in the timeline. The reason for this is that it explains where Ganondorf is actually born in his human form. It's just that now we know that Ganondorf is the incarnation of Demise. Now, in this game is where things get a little bit out of control. You see, Ocarina of Time actually has two endings, where most people see it as just one ending. Now, this is the timeline of events as they happen in Ocarina of Time. When Link opens up the doors of the Temple of Time, he actually lets Ganondorf inside by accident, so he goes in and steals the Triforce of Power. Now Link stays in the temple in a time stasis for 7 years, but after he goes out, he defeats Ganon. The problem arises when Zelda, in her infinite wisdom, decided to send Link back in time to relive his childhood. This opened up a new timeline for the new Link. Now, as you can see in the ending of Ocarina of Time, this new Link that was sent back in time, he actually goes back to Zelda. Now, this Link actually warns Zelda of what is going to happen in the future with Ganondorf. So what's going to happen now is that you have two different timelines of two different events that happen. On the original story with the adult Link, Ganondorf actually obtains the Triforce of Power and conquers Hyrule, which in turn ends up killing most of the people from the castle, and in the end ends up with Link killing Ganondorf and sealing him in the Secret Realm, at which point Zelda takes Link back to the past, which eliminates Link from this timeline. On the second timeline with Child Link, he warns Zelda of what Ganondorf is going to do in the future, and because there's no reason for him to actually open the doors of time this time, Ganondorf never really gets his hold into the Triforce of Power. Because of this, Ganon never actually conquers Hyrule in this timeline. Now, what I meant when I said that things get out of control is that different games take on these different timelines. Now, I'll go back to talk about the adult timeline later on, but first I'm gonna start with the child timeline. Now, because Ganondorf never really conquered Hyrule, he never resurrected Volvagia. Link never got to kill Twinrova, but much more importantly, the Happy Mask Salesman never died. Now, in this timeline where the Mask Salesman never died, he actually goes to Termina, and the events of the Majora's Mask unfolds. Now, we all know that Majora's Mask comes right after Ocarina of Time, so I'm not gonna indulge into explaining why that is, as it is pretty self-explanatory. Now, before we finish with Ocarina of Time, I want to mention the importance of the sages in this game, as that is one of the reasons why Ocarina of Time is in the position that it is. The sages are actually talked about in many of the future games, especially in the first games in the series. Having the sages actually being alive in the game means that this is probably one of the first games in the series. Now, after Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask comes Twilight Princess. The reason for this position is that we're actually talking about the same Ganondorf. Now, because this Ganondorf never really got to conquer Hyrule, and they were warned of what he was going to do in the future, they actually incarcerate Ganondorf. Now, at any point in time between Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess, the king decided to kill Ganondorf. The problem was that they couldn't accomplish it, so instead they banished him into the Twilight Realm. And this is where Twilight Princess picks up, when Ganondorf gives Zant all of his power to help him get out of the Twilight Zone. And now is where Four Swords comes into place. The thing is, Four Swords is a pretty remarkable game in terms of storyline and where it actually holds up in the story. Now, this game is a sequel to the Minish Cap, which I put it as the first game in the series. Now, the thing is, even if it's a sequel, it doesn't have to be coming right after it in terms of timeline. The Four Swords simply delve into the same sword that the Minish Cap talks about. Now, the reason why I put this in this exact position is because the sequel of Four Swords is Four Swords Adventure, and this game is a prequel to A Link to the Past. But let's not get too much ahead of ourselves, let's talk about this special sword. Now, in these three games, they don't actually talk about the Master Sword, they reference it here and there, but we deal with this other special sword. Now, this sword has sealing powers similar to that of the Master Sword. The difference though is that the holder of this sword will be split into four. Now, Four Swords is a pretty short game with nothing spectacular, so we're gonna skip that up. But Four Swords Adventures, being the sequel to this game, it's more interesting. Now, this is interesting because the story of this game deals with the War of Imprisonment, which is the literal prologue of A Link to the Past, which is the reason why it is so obvious that this comes right before A Link to the Past. Now, the other thing that makes this game so special, and the reason why I also put it right before A Link to the Past, is because it explains where Ganondorf gets his trident, which from now on we'll see on each of the boss fights from Ganon. Now in this game, it is said that Link will actually never get to use the Master Sword again, as when he collected the Triforce, Hyrule entered an era of prosperity and a golden age. Which it holds true, as you will never see the Master Sword again in the series after this spot. Now things would go smoothly from here if it wasn't for Oracles of Seasons and Oracles of Ages. Now the main problem with this game is that it doesn't reference any other game, and it doesn't really fall into place with any other game. The only things that we can grab from this game that can help us put it into a spot in the timeline are 3 small but very important points. As a first, Twinrova exists in this game, which means that it must be from this timeline, as we have yet to kill them. The second point to prove this theory is the fact that Ganondorf actually has the trident, which means that it must come after the Four Swords trilogy, and it must be from this timeline as well. And last but definitely not least is the fact that when you finish the game completely with the 2 cartridges, you get to go on a raft to the ocean in the end. Now this is important because Link's Awakening actually starts with you on a raft. Now this could be a ridiculous coincidence, but I don't think so, and it is the best link that we have into putting this game on a timeline. Now A Link to the Past is well known to be a prequel to the original Zelda. The reason for this is that in the packaging and in the marketing material for the game, this was official. So a couple of centuries later, after A Link to the Past, Oracle of Ages / Seasons and Link's Awakening comes The Legend of Zelda. Now this is pretty straightforward, as The Legend of Zelda had a known sequel, which was The Legend of Zelda 2. So there really isn't that much to it. The cool thing though is that in this last 2 game saga, Link actually takes control of the Triforce of Power, which leaves Ganondorf unpowered as ashes in the floor. Link wakes up the Princess Zelda from her slumber in Zelda 2, and they end up living happily ever after. Now the thing is, the Master Sword is not actually used anymore in the game after A Link to the Past, so this game actually does make itself for a good ending. So now this is the end of this timeline, but we'll go back to Ocarina of Time once again. So now we explored the child timeline in Ocarina of Time, but we're gonna go into the adult timeline. Now in here, Ganondorf takes over Hyrule and Link seals him into Sacred Realm. Before we go any further though, you have to keep some things in mind. Twinrova is dead, so you will not see her again for the remainder of this series in this timeline. Also, the masked salesman is dead from Ganondorf taking over the castle, which means that the events on Majora's Masks never unfolded in this timeline. And much more importantly, because Link actually killed Ganondorf and banished him to the Sacred Realm, he was never actually sent to the Twilight Realm by the sages and the king, so the events of Twilight Princess never actually really happened either in this timeline. But if you remember, Zelda sent Link back in time, which means that in this timeline Link doesn't exist, which means that he'll have to be reborn again to be able to fight Ganon. The problem is, Ganon actually escapes from the Sacred Realm before a new Link is reborn. So with no Link to fight Ganon, the gods actually flood Hyrule in order to keep Ganondorf trapped in the bottom of the ocean. And after that, Wind Waker picks up. Now this timeline is much simpler than the other one, just because Link actually gets to kill Ganondorf in the end in the bottom of the ocean. Because of this, Ganondorf hasn't yet to be able to revive from this timeline. Now 2 games have been released in this timeline as well. The Phantom Hourglass is a direct sequel to Wind Waker, and after that, the Spirit Tracks is a direct sequel to the Phantom Hourglass. So in terms of their position in the timeline, it is pretty straightforward. And with that, I present to you guys the timeline for Zelda. Now it took me a lot of time to get all of this information together and to make this video, so it would be greatly appreciated if you guys would like the video and comment on what you thought about it. I am greatly interested in reading what you guys have to say about this timeline or whatever timeline you guys think it's real. If you guys disagree with something, please go ahead and put it in the comments. But with that said guys, have a great day.